Although plenty of aspects of Arya Stark's characterization in A Song of Ice and Fire were either simplified or omitted when her character was translated from the page to the screen, there is one particularly major way in which Game of Thrones altered her character so radically that it essentially made the TV version so different from the book version that the Arya Stark fans saw on Game of Thrones was actually the polar opposite of the Arya Stark that readers became familiar with in the novel series. The presentation of gender in George R.R. Martin's books is interesting, and is a major part of the world building in Westeros. Although Arya's preferences and behaviors would be seen as quite normal in the real world, the world that she lives in has extremely rigid standards for gendered behavior, making Arya Stark a fairly gender non-conforming character from the start of her individual arc. And it's clear that the author has intended for her to be seen this way, because while many characters in the story experience some form of hidden or mistaken identity, Arya's gender identity in particular is a consistent point of confusion or contention. Not only are other characters confused about whether she's a girl or a boy fairly often, but Arya also intentionally poses as a boy during her journey with the Night's Watch recruits. And once she joins the Faceless Men, one of the largest aspects of her character arc is about abandoning, concealing, and altering the presentation of her identity in the most extreme ways possible. In the grand scheme of the world of Ice and Fire, there really aren't many characters that are quite as intensely focused on gender non-conformity and non-identity than Arya Stark is. And while Game of Thrones adapted many of the major beats of these character traits and storylines for the series, it seems clear that the show really missed the forest for the trees when it came to this overarching theme. Yes, they included some of these plot points, but it doesn't seem like they actually understood what this subtext truly meant. In fact, it seems like they misunderstood it so completely that, at least in one hugely important way, the series turned Arya into someone who was the complete opposite of what George R.R. Martin intended to be. And they took a character who was meant to have an extremely egalitarian point of view and turned her into an overt misogynist. Arya's ability to relate to people of nearly every social strata in Westeros is one of her most appealing qualities as a character. And it's an element that was pretty obviously incorporated into her characterization in Game of Thrones. But Arya isn't just egalitarian when it comes to class in A Song of Ice and Fire. She is also quite ardent and unusual in her general insistence that women are just as important, dynamic, and unique as men. Yes, she's a tomboy who has a difficult time relating to most of the noble women around her, but she's also continuously insistent about the value of women. And more importantly, she doesn't devalue women specifically on the basis that they don't rise to her particular standards. But unfortunately, the same can't be said about her TV counterpart. One of the most frustrating aspects of Game of Thrones is how often the writers seem to take certain, more nuanced or complex aspects of female characters in the books and essentially translate all of their behaviors and points of view through the classic cool girl, not like other girls lens. It's obvious that the show has a very narrow perception of what a strong female character actually is. And that character archetype very consistently seems to involve being unlike a stereotypical feminine woman, as well as looking down on almost all other women. And this is a point of view that is unfortunately reiterated with many characters. Whether it's the fellow gender nonconformist Brienne, the classically feminine book character Sansa, or the character who was seemingly introduced to purely be a not-like-other-girls girl, Lyanna Mormont. But Arya is not exempt from this perspective either, despite the fact that it's diametrically opposed from the basic intention behind her character. There are unfortunately many different examples of Arya being outright misogynistic in Game of Thrones, but one moment that really exemplifies how radically and badly the show altered her character occurs relatively early on in the story. Although Arya and Tywin Lannister do technically cross paths in the novels, they have no significant relationship or interactions within the story. They simply occupy the same place at the same time. And, given that Arya is posing as a commoner at Harrenhal, she has no real face time with Tywin. Obviously, the show changed that particular plot point in a major way. And, while it may have been a mistake from an actual storytelling perspective, it's actually pretty defensible and understandable from a cinematic one. Putting Arya and Tywin together not only streamlines the storyline in a way that's much easier to follow for watchers who haven't read the books, but it also consolidates the time and money that would have been spent on the Harrenhal scenes, and it puts two of the show's strongest actors together. And, if Game of Thrones had simply left it at that, it might have been a beneficial alteration overall. However, one particular exchange between Tywin and Arya truly betrays how badly the writers seem to misunderstand Arya as a character. Tywin invites Arya to eat with him, and they begin discussing the history of Harrenhal and Aegon's conquest. When Tywin says that Aegon changed the game and conquered the world with dragons, Arya clarifies that it was Rhaenys and Visenya too, and adds that Visenya was a great warrior. Tywin says that Visenya is a heroine of Arya's, which is unusual, because most girls like songs about pretty maidens. Arya retorts by saying that most girls are idiots, and Tywin tells her that she reminds him of Cersei. It's a relatively brief interaction, but it's completely contradictory to Arya's book characterization, and seems to make it clear that the show writer's interpretation of Arya as a character is that she simply idolizes badass women and thinks traditionally feminine women are morons. Which truly feels like it's exactly what George R.R. Martin was not trying to say with her character. Obviously, the notion that Arya is in any way similar to Cersei when it comes to her perception of people or the world at large is absurd. And although this comment only reflects Tywin's perception of both characters, it seems to be a pretty big clue that the Game of Thrones writers are missing one of the most important dimensions of Arya Stark as a character. One of Arya's biggest character arcs revolves around her perception of justice versus vengeance, and much of Arya's point of view regarding the importance of women is simply driven by the fact that she naturally has an unusually egalitarian perspective on the world. She doesn't have the tendency to differentiate between people in general, whether that's in regards to their social status or their gender. So, the notion that she would look down upon typical women really flies in the face of Arya's inherent outlook on life. And unfortunately, the subplot that Arya and Tywin's scenes seems to have replaced illustrated that more clearly than almost any other moments in Arya's book arc so far. Because, although it's relatively minor in the grand scheme of things, Arya's interactions with Jaqen, and one of the particular names that she gives him to kill, are extremely indicative of Arya's feelings towards other women. And they directly contradict Arya's statements about most girls being idiots in Game of Thrones. Chiswyck is one particular character who was edited out when the book story was translated for the screen. And while he only has a few scenes that actually make him relevant, his mere omission from the TV series is a massive hint that the show's writers didn't understand how significant he truly was, and that they essentially didn't understand one of the most vital aspects of Arya Stark as a character. Chiswyck is a part of Gregor Clegane's gang in the Riverlands, and when he mistreats Arya, she adds him to her kill list. However, he winds up going to the very top of that list when Arya hears him humorously recalling how he, the Mountain, and all of his men violently assaulted and raped a young girl who looked about 13 years old, stabbed her brother, and then demanded a refund from her father when they felt that she didn't satisfy them well enough. Despite the fact that Arya already had him as one of the many names on her list, this encounter is what pushes her over the edge. And a few days after hearing this story, she names Chiswyck to Jaqen as the first person she wants killed. Arya's Jaqen kills are very childish and not necessarily thought through, but it's so incredibly meaningful and indicative of her personality that the first person she has Jaqen murder is someone she heard jovially recount the horrific exploitation and abuse of a young girl that he participated in. Yes, Arya could have made more strategic choices, but she had days to think this request over. Choosing Chiswyck as her first death was not an impulse, nor was it a mistake in her mind. At the very same point in the story, the show had Arya telling Tywin that most girls are idiots, when in the books, she is literally using the tiniest shred of power that she has to get some form of justice or revenge for a supposedly weak woman that she'll never even meet. Hearing the way that Chiswyck abused another woman, and her brother and father, is the deciding factor that makes Arya say his name to Jaqen. Even when Arya is basically a powerless slave that's constantly witnessing unimaginable horrors, she hears about another powerless girl, who undoubtedly isn't as tough as she is, being horrifically mistreated. And Arya has the person who enjoyed abusing her killed, regardless of the fact that she didn't know if this victim was stupid or mean, or was the type of girl who would call her Arya Horseface. In a lot of big and small ways, George R.R. Martin went pretty far out of his way to establish that Arya is not a not-like-other-girls girl, who thinks that she's better than the women around her because she doesn't behave like them. Yes, she can react negatively towards other women, or towards traditionally feminine things, but this reaction seems to be driven more by Arya's feelings of inferiority and her discomfort about not being able to measure up to the ideals of women in her social circle, rather than being some inherent dislike towards women or girly things in general. But this particular moment in A Song of Ice and Fire seems to unequivocally demonstrate exactly how Arya feels about injustice against women, and women in general. Arya can be in the weakest and most disempowered state that she's ever been in during her life so far. And her first instinct is to punish those who are responsible for abusing someone whose social status and gender all but ensures that they can never get any measure of real justice against someone like Gregor Clegane, or his men. Thematically, there are a few ideas that are more important to Arya Stark's individual character arc than the concepts of justice versus revenge. But one of the traits that makes Arya so distinct from so many other people is that she inherently believes in the values of justice for everyone. The notion that she would write off half of the entire population and castigate a group that she just so happens to be a part of is absurd. Ultimately, Arya is arguably a character who got one of the best overall stories in Game of Thrones. However, this alteration of her storyline seems to very strongly indicate that the writers had a fundamental and drastic misunderstanding of who Arya Stark was meant to be as a person. There were plenty of characteristic dimensions that the show's writers overlooked. But erasing a scene where Arya demands the death of a gleeful abuser of women, and replacing it with a scene of her insulting girls as a whole, is really the perfect demonstration of how badly the TV series misunderstood the entire point of Arya as a character. But what do you think? Did the omission of Chiswyck dramatically alter Arya's entire character arc? Leave your thoughts and opinions below, and if you're interested in more content like this, like and subscribe.